everyone. Welcome to the June webinar, PDH Hour with Glen, exploring the vital link between cost avoidance and liability reduction and effective inspection and documentation practices. Today, I'm going to be joined by my wife, Joanna, and we figured we'd tag team this subject a little bit because we've been seeing a lot of issues during our construction audits and issues in the field, and we think it's a big enough topic that Joanna, as the owner of CQA Solutions, should be involved and can articulate things from a business owner perspective. So as we get started, what I want to do is start these with a safety tip like we usually do in any of our meetings. So today's safety tip, I'm going to take a minute or so here, go over it, but we're really going to try to deal with a safe or serious topic, how not to die in a porta potty. You don't often think about porta potties when you're using them and the risks that are in there, but you know, some of the things that we see is a lot of hidden risk: spiders, bees, wasps, other insects that bite, scorpions, snakes, gases, and I'm not talking about the gases that come from the porta-john themselves, but the placement of them, location, makes a big difference. You'll see people that put these down slope of an active landfill, and sometimes the methane gas, other gases build up in the porta-john, and it really becomes kind of a confined space environment. And you can see in this photo here, you know, it's the porta-johns right next to where they might be swinging the boom of an excavator while they're loading material. So there's no barricades there other than a tire. You know, another thing with location is the triangle of death. When you're using a pulley, block and tackle type deployment method, there's a pulley, fixed location, and when they're using that block and tackle, you're moving one piece of equipment, pulling the liner up. This is an actual hole from where the pulley shot out, went right through the porta-john one of our techs was actually going to be using, and he realized it was in the triangle of death, decided to go somewhere else, and lucky for him, he's still alive because he did that. So recommendations when it comes to the porta potties on site: really perform a job hazard analysis for each location, mitigate the risks through appropriate actions such as selecting safe locations, bugs, snake repellents, pesticides, whatever it takes that are safe for humans. Barriers, you know, there's been several near misses in my career, and Jersey barriers actually have been hit, but they save lives. And regularly reevaluate the location because these porta-johns are often moved as the project progresses. So evaluate these locations. So now we'll get into the meat of the presentation. I'm going to turn this over to Joanna at this time.
Hi, everybody. Today we're going to take a little bit different approach, and our webinars tend to be fairly technical and very detail oriented. And the second half of the webinar will be technical and detail oriented, but this first half, we're going to take a 50,000-foot view at the industry. It gets really easy to be so busy in our jobs and in our roles that we're down in the weeds and we're not really looking at some of the big picture items. But as an industry, we need to stop and look at the big picture from time to time. And so we're going to do that today a little bit. And some of it's going to be some key principles that really should be ruling over everything we do in the industry. And the first one of those is containment systems are corporate assets. We don't always treat them like a fiscal asset, but they certainly go on the balance books like a fiscal asset. And assets, as we're going to talk a little bit later, have some very specific guidance on how to manage, purchase, and maintain a fiscal asset. And we need to start looking at our landfills that same way. So we're going to look at the fact that not only are these corporate assets something that produce revenue for our site owners, but they're also something that can cost significant revenue in the liabilities. If we have a breach of a liability, the cost is astronomical to our site owners. And I want to take a minute and give a shout out to all of our site owners. You guys do an amazing job of dealing with everybody's garbage, literally. And we don't always appreciate landfills. They get a lot of slack. A lot of people beat up these site owners continually. And it seems like everybody's hand is in their pocket all the time. I was recently dealing with a site, and that site's annual fees alone were almost 25% of the state regulators' revenue for the year. That's unbelievable to me. The amount of money our site owners are paying just to the regulators. And then they're paying our engineers, they're paying construction costs, they're paying maintenance, and they're carrying a lot of liability. And if they're willing to take and deal with all of our garbage, I mean, none of us want to house it on our site. I mean, I don't want to go bury my trash. I don't want to figure out how to recycle it. So I'm really glad that we have this service. But if we appreciate the service, we certainly need to support our site owners and to support the work they're trying to do for our communities. And not only in the short term of thank you for taking my trash, but thank you for keeping that trash and that paint and that rotten meat and everything else in it from polluting our waterways. And so part of this first point is going to be really looking at our responsibility to the companies that support our society. And this is not a paid advertisement, trust me, because I will equally give them praise and a hard time when needed. So understanding that the liabilities for these sites can far exceed revenues brought in needs to be a pretty heavy point to us when we're doing our work. Are we understanding that we miss a seam, that seam pops open, that seam leaks, and the soil was desiccated, and it's hitting a waterway? All of a sudden, everything they made and more could be at risk for them as a company. And are we treating these sites with that care and that intentionality that needs to happen? So, recently I was talking with a regulator, and he made a really good point to me. He says, so often on some of these sites, he said, we're looking at them and it's all about, we don't have big budgets. How do we minimize costs in every possible direction? And what he said to me more than once, he says, is people need to remember when it comes to the pay now, pay later scenarios, later always cost more. And sometimes we're so worried about saving 0.25% on a job site that we miss that we've opened them up to massive liabilities. And what is it if we spend another $10,000 compared to if they got 100 million and all of a sudden in lawsuits and fines? So we really need to keep that broader picture in mind as we move forward. Now, the next step is we focus heavily on what are our materials? Are the materials tested? Is the engineering sound? But as an industry, we've missed the boat on field. We don't focus on field construction the way we need to. We don't recognize it as the trade that it is. And the problem is you can spend $60 million on material and another 10 million on engineering. But if that doesn't get installed right in the field, none of it mattered. It didn't matter that the other 70 million was spent because now we got a problem, and that problem is going to cost them well more if there's an environmental contaminant issue. So we're going to start by defining CQA. And now this is not self-serving. This is really us taking a look at the broader picture of what is CQA meant to be. And here's some interesting statistics. So in 2005, they said that on average, 12% of a project's value was lost to rework. That's huge, especially when you think most contractors operate on a 3 to 5% margin. And 12% of the total project values in rework. Then we're going to look, and it says that design errors account for roughly 40 to 60% of all construction errors. That was a surprising statistic. I did not expect design errors to be one of the largest issues that we have in construction errors. So that means, are we individually being accountable as companies? Do we have good QC programs to make sure that what we're delivering to these site owners who deserve our best are getting it? And we'll get into some more of those details as we go on. So 30% of the respondents in a survey said that more than 0.5% of the time their data is bad and it results in poor decision making. So we're not communicating the way we need to communicate. And this is through all construction, not just our industry. So in across construction as a whole, decisions made using bad data are estimated to have cost the construction industry $88.69 billion in rework cost, accounting for 14% of all rework performed in 2020. These are some staggering numbers. To understand that we need to think about the big picture. Are we getting correct information? Are the designs, are all the construction documents compatible with each other? Are they up to date on their standards? Has everybody got the most updated set of plans? We've had some scenarios where there are a lot of arguments and fights, and come to find out people had different versions, and it costs these site owners a lot of money. So that's some of the things that we need to look at. So if you look at construction as a whole, they have a very different definition of CQA than the geosynthetic containment industry has. So from the Federal Highway Administration comes this top definition, and it defines QA as all those planned and systematic actions necessary to provide the confidence that a product or facility will perform satisfactorily in service. It doesn't say, are the engineer's designs met? It doesn't say, are the construction document requirements met? What it really wants to know, is this construction going to do its job? Now that's a proactive thing. It's not saying, hey, did we check mark every box? It says, is this asset going to perform the way an asset should perform? And that's a way we as a containment industry need to begin to change our philosophy. Across the board, QA doesn't happen just by firms like CQA. It happens in the engineering, it happens in the project management, it happens in the field. This is a full life cycle thing. And look at the next definition. And so this next definition is great. And it actually says that. It says QA is a systematic and proactive approach aimed at preventing defects and optimizing process throughout the construction project life cycle. Really think about that. And this is the primary goal of QA is to ensure construction processes are carried out correctly and efficiently to meet the client's expectations and the industry standards. A lot of times we say, hey, look, if it's not in the QA plan, it doesn't matter. This definition says whether the industry standard is in the QA plan or not, the industry standard matters. And we need to be meeting those industry standards. And that's something that from the design to the project management to the field, are we meeting the industry standards? Not just are we check marking the exact boxes to get the sign off, but are we serving our clients, those site owners, in a manner that is in their best interest, that gives them an asset that is going to perform well for them? Here's the current definition that a lot of people in our industry use. And it's what we would call a reactive definition, something the construction industry would call a QC role and not a QA role. And it says, where you see highlighted, that a planned system of activities that provides the owner and permitting agency with the assurance that the facility was constructed as specified in the design. It's very limiting. Hey, look, was the design met? And the further you see it again in yellow, it says it's to assess if the installer or contractor is in compliance with the plans and specifications for the project. It doesn't say, is it going to work right? Is the weld going to hold? It doesn't say, is the system going to operate? Hey, look, did we meet the bare minimum standards of the documents? That's a very reactive approach. And it's a mindset that needs to change in our industry. I sit at my desk and on a routine basis, I get to talk to site owners who have had massive failures on their project. We're doing failure analysis, we're doing forensic audits, and these guys have hired some of the best firms out there. They have hired some of the most theoretically competent firms, and they have been screwed over time and time again. And they say, hey, look, we met Pale and Shear, what else matters? Come on, we owe them a better service than that. And a few of you might be like, oh, she's getting a little worked up right now. Yeah, I'm going to own that. I am passionate about what we do. I care about what we do. And at the end of the day, to anybody who thinks being passionate about making sure that we're doing a good job for these site owners is a problem, I'm going to tell you to check yourself and see if you really need to stay in this industry. If you're not passionate about your job and passionate about what you're doing, passionate about taking care of your clients, if you're not, there's some self-evaluation that probably needs to go on. And I'm certainly not going to apologize for being passionate about it. I think that they deserve that we would give them that. So, misunderstanding. Glenn's going to talk about how this, again, goes to reactive and not proactive.
Yeah, I think I showed this slide in an earlier webinar for data recording, but we see that people are substituting technologies for CQA, and it just shows a total misunderstanding of the actual role of CQA, which we're going to get into here in a bit. But CQA should be basically an insurance policy for the owner, an enforcement policy, as we'll talk about too, making sure that things are being done in a proactive method. And the data recording. This is a quote from patent application, or actually was approved, but all but eliminating the need for third-party inspection. And I talked to the people that were behind this, and there was still a misunderstanding. I don't want to argue with them, and I respect the people that are doing this and promoting growth in the industry, but it shows a full lack of understanding. You can't replace CQA. It's more than documentation, and that's what too many people think it is, and we're going to touch on that here in a minute.
So one of the things that we need to understand is that our trade, and when I say our trade, I mean regulators, I mean engineers, I mean project managers, I mean project managers for construction, project managers for the site owner, and the technicians. What we're doing is playing a giant version of the telephone game. Everybody remembers in school when they tell you, tell the next kid that John the monkey carried 5 bananas to the library. And you whispered, John the monkey carried 4 bananas to the grocery store. And as you go on, that story changes. And by the time you get to the end of the line of the students, we don't even have a monkey anymore. We have an elephant who ran into the jungle and ate a papaya. I mean, the telephone game never works. The story never stays the same, and we all know that. But that's how the field applications are being treated in our industry. This is a trade, and there needs to be formal training. There needs to be formal processes, formal procedures that are proactive, that are reigning over every step of the life cycle of a containment project. And so when we talk about QA today, it is not just the technician portion. It is the engineering portion, it's the design, it's the plans, it's the permitting, it's everybody involved in the process has a role in QA. If you look at the construction industry's definition, it is not a single firm. It is the entire team of people that are bringing the project to life that are involved in this. And within our companies and within our industry, we need to begin to create formal proactive processes that help us solidify these trades instead of playing the telephone game, because it's not working. And we see that on a regular basis in our organization when we deal with failures. Now, knowing that this QA doesn't represent just my company, it's our whole industry. Whatever your role is, if you're the manager for the site owner, you're the regulator, you're the engineer, this brute here in the yellow vest needs to be you. And behind that brute is a corporate asset that represents a lot of money to the corporation, who's asking all of us to do our jobs thoroughly and effectively. And our job as being a part of that QA team is going to be to stand between that site and environmental failures, contamination, bad public relations, revenue loss, operational inefficiencies, all of these things that can negatively impact a site owner. Our job is to stand and defend that asset and deliver them a fully functioning asset on time, under budget, that performs as it's supposed to perform and has not been plagued by all these other issues, because we all stood up and we did our job in a way that defended that site owner and their asset. And we need to change our mentality. So going into the field, we're going to let Glenn talk about his favorite slide here.
Yeah, my Hall of Shame, which we've been putting out recently on my blog again, but it's a pretty popular thing, but trust me, you don't want to end up on the Hall of Shame. It's really poor quality, and somebody really did a bad job to earn a place in the Hall of Shame. And it's things that we don't want to see, things that are avoidable. And, we're going to find it in our audits. We go through things, we're going to find problems. And any of our clients that have had the audit performed can attest to that. We've had people tell us we saved them millions of dollars because we find things that others are missing. They have the same problem time and time again, paying the top dollar for an engineering firm to do CQA design, Same thing with the installer, and we're finding these issues, and they shouldn't be there. We'll go on to the next slide here. Um,
So
yeah,
these people represent regulators, they represent engineers, they represent technicians, site owners, managers. And when we ask them about what training have you had, and we hear things like, oh, well, in fact, we have one guy, he goes, I started my career in QA. I'm like, well, what training did you get? And this just happened in the last month or so. He goes, well, he goes, I told him I didn't know what I was doing. They handed me a clipboard and said, speak with authority. True story. That was the entirety of the training he got. We've seen other ones where we've had seen literally people that were the rock pickers the day before become technicians. We've had regulators. In fact, I just had this conversation this week with a regulator. And I said, tell me about what formalized training processes you have for the regulators so that they understand how they're regulating. And the response was, and after a really long pause, he goes, well, it's somewhat formal. We have somebody follow somebody around for a little while. Okay. So this is one of these things in the industry. If we're looking at that 50,000 foot view, then what are we doing to change these kind of responses where we're seeing people say, oh, I got to watch this. I saw this. Here's the formalized training. Here's the documents. Here's the QC processes that need to happen and are happening within our organization. So Glenn's going to talk a little bit about how we need to change our mentality. If we're looking to protect the liabilities and mitigate risk, it's a documentation versus observation discussion.
yeah, exactly. Thanks, Joanna. What we're seeing in the industry quite a bit is quite a bit of variance in how the role of CQA is actually performed. What the requirements are. It might be by state, might be within the state, different agencies. You see different things in mining versus agriculture versus waste containment versus CCR containment. Depends on whether the site's on a river, whether it's not on a river, but CQA really needs to be uniform to do it properly. And you see this documentation mentality where the role is really documentation. Some places just get the information from the installer. Um, you have others that only perform 10% or so of the testing, like destructive testing. So you have a failure on one of those 10. What about the other 90% that weren't tested? It opens up the owner to real liabilities there when you're only doing this. Just copying information from the liner. We see that quite a bit. And, a quote that we heard from people in the industry, my job is just to make sure that boxes are check marked. And then the observation mentality is totally different. Really the last bullet there, your documentation really should confirm your observations and match your observations. The two shouldn't differ, but your observation should be first and foremost. And some examples, pipe penetrations that can't be welded, textured interfaces need to be tested and they're not being tested. A big thing that we've been talking about in previous webinars and the industry is working to address is overheating of the welds because of the peel and shear testing. Installers are a lot of times overheating this and compromising the liner integrity to pass their tests, but they're compromising the long-term liner. And then extrusion welding, another example, crew switching personnel from task to task. Your grinders, your welders usually stand the same, but you're seeing different people heat tech, different people bevel, different people grind, and that's a real issue. We found that that's an issue. Um, the perceived role here are two of the roles, and I haven't believed this. When I was first in the industry, that I was really a glorified wheel pusher or pencil pusher. Those were common terms we called ourselves until I realized what the role was really supposed to be when you're out on a liner job. I had some pretty good training in my career, and I think that's lacking. But you see people, they're taking measurements and they're documenting. They're not even looking at what's going on around them. And you can see that in this next slide here. This is actually slides, photos from audits we performed. And you have your CQA technicians down here. You have two of them. They're plenty staffed. This was a job where they staffed it well, but they have no clue what their responsibility is. The guy's up here about to weld through paint, which is a bad idea. Your weld's going to fail. He ground through the paint, spread it out, and they're down here watching it. They have no comprehension of what their role is. And same with a CQA on the left. He's watching the vacuum test on the right. He's too far away to verify that the guy is doing his job, that he's meeting the pressure requirement, that there's no leaks. Um, so it's just a waste of money. So there's a catch 22 there. Sometimes you got the bodies, but they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. So documentation with proactive processes, what is it? It's verifications, it's audits, it's evaluations of materials, to make sure that they meet the requirements of the engineer's plans and they're properly followed. But it needs to be more than just meeting the plans. It needs to be assessing, is it like the overheating welds? Are there issues? You got to document the quality, talk on a regular basis to the engineer. Um, and then, kind of reflecting back, CQA site staffing, in the early 90s when I started, typical installation was going to ask for 80,000 to 100,000 square feet a day that they wanted the earthwork contractor to have ready so they could deploy. And that's all they were going to cover. And back when I started, you had a CQA crew that was often 3 to 6 technicians, depending on activities, one person monitoring deployment, or somebody on subgrade, usually the earthwork tech, but deployment subgrade might have been combined. Your seaming, trial seams usually had a technician, non-destructive testing, full-time monitoring by a technician, repairs monitored by a technician, vacuum boxing monitored by a technician, and then any other materials that were going down had a technician. And you compare that to today, installers, they can place 4 to 5 acres or more, and you routinely see this now. So kudos to them. They found a way of speeding it up, but some of those processes are compromising the liner. And I think installers can still install, but you're limited to a crew size now. Usually one technician, maybe two if you're really lucky. And a lot of times that second technician is going to have shared responsibility because of the cost, and everybody wants to get them off site as quick as possible. But the installation process hasn't changed. They're still doing all these same things, only they're doing it on a larger scale. And, our CQA has gone to a smaller scale and your technician. So we're not really performing good CQA. Um, there's a lot to the role, the CQA involvement. The CQA really starts before the project starts. They need to review the construction documents, which are the CQA plan, the technical specifications, and the construction drawings. See if there's any discrepancies, resolve those either before or at the pre-construction meeting. And here's an example of, I think I showed this in previous webinars, but some geosynthetics issues we've found. There's an air pressure test was required on a job. And this was required, they list the ASTM, but the ASTM doesn't tell you what's a passing test. It has no starting pressure, no allowable drop. It has nothing in there, but yet, when we're doing our forensic audit, these things were all done on a job, but there was no specification. There was no standard for it. You've seen variances, you had 2 pound, 3 pound, 4 pound losses. You had starting pressures that didn't meet what we typically see in the industry, but nobody could hold them accountable to anything. And that's the type of things where it needs to be addressed before the project starts. Um, you know, the technicians that are going to be out there, the CQA techs and the engineer really should go over the specifications, make a specification summary, present it at the pre-construction meeting, make sure that the installer is on the same page. You can resolve a lot of issues ahead of time if you do this. And as an example, we threw in here, when the ambient temperature gets to whatever the low temperature cutoff is, we see specs that say 40 degrees, 32 degrees, anywhere in between there. But that's not the time to start looking at the cold weather sealing plan like a GRI GM9. You need to have it addressed, have a plan before you get out there. You start addressing it when the temperature gets to this, and that's the first time you look at it, you're going to have issues. You're going to have problems. You're going to delay the project, and these can all be avoided beforehand. And then moving on to the pre-construction meeting, as I mentioned, you know, everybody should be reviewing these and on the same page. This is your last chance to get everything on the same page before the construction takes off. And a lot of times we see pre-construction meetings, the CQA tech, the lead CQA tech that's going to be out there isn't even invited to the meeting in a lot of instances. And then there's other, parties that should be there as well as the installer foreman and QC, but I'm not really going to dive in there right now. But there should be adequate, competent manpower coverage. Training and roles or responsibilities is essential. I remember somewhere in midpoint of my career before starting our own project, I'm out on a job site. I'm doing earthwork, and they brought somebody in that didn't know anything about the geosynthetics, and I didn't have time to go over them. Over there, we had a supervisor that would come out every now and then and go over things, but he's like, man, there's big wrinkles, and he shouldn't be allowing these. I'm like, but he hasn't had any training. Nobody's trained him. Somebody needs to train him. 1 to 2 technicians on a project that's putting out 2, 3, 4 acres a day, that's not sufficient. Even 1 acre, it may not be sufficient. It just depends on what's going on if you want really true quality um, assurance being performed. And we just threw this slide in here. It's something that we talk about in our trainings, but back in somewhere around 2000 or somewhere, I was told by a supervisor that a monkey could do my job. And that just illustrates his poor understanding of what CQA is. I bring issues to his attention, and we had a well-trained team of technicians, maybe the best I had seen at that point in my career. And there were 4 or 5 of us that had college backgrounds and certified in NICET at the time. And he berated us. He said, a monkey could do your job. And that just shows, people don't understand the role of CQA. If you think data can replace us, if you think monkeys can replace us, you don't understand. And I don't know how you're certifying a job if you don't understand it. But, I mentioned observation should be first, foremost, documentation secondary. This is an example here. I've shown, similar slides, but if you look at it, you see different coloration of the geomembrane panels. And that's not because they're covered in geotextile. This is agri microspike material that's installed. And the black side up is the way it's supposed to be installed. That's their design top upper surface. And it was installed with the bottom side up on. The installer does this a lot of times. They'll flip it so that their QC can keep track of what panels came off of what roll. So they know, if they're double checking their documentation, they can say, oh, I see the different color. But that's not always a good thing to do. You did the friction test with this material with the right side up, the designed surface up, and there's a different friction angle. I've talked to all the suppliers, and they say this on their calendared products and even on your other textured products, that the friction angle isn't the same. And you're on a slope. We brought this to the engineer's attention, but the engineer approved it because it was only 20, 30-foot high slope. But these are things that need to be caught, and if it's caught, there needs to be a resolution before the installer is allowed to continue to do something bad. And I'll get into that here in a few slides. But some processes, documentation should be complete at the end of the day, cross-checked each night. You generate a punch list. The punch list should be checked. And, you got to get to site early a lot of times. If you're the lead CQA, stay late, work through lunch, take lunch when you can. These are all things that you may need to do. And, I threw boo-hoo in here because that's going to hurt people. People want to take their breaks, but CQA can't stop. You got to be proactive. You need more people on the site. When you're understaffed, this is what happens. Lots of photographs and notes in the field book. And another tip is getting the destructive samples marked. You need a quick turnaround to know if you have a problem or not. You want to get those samples marked. You want to get them cut, but you don't want to do it before the non-destructive testing is done. But you need to get them out the same shift if you can, so you can get results the next day as soon as possible, so problems don't propagate. Looking at engineers, the next presentation coming up is really going to touch on the engineers, because I don't know how you can certify projects with some of this stuff going on. If you're sending CQA technicians that don't have any training on how to do their job, if they don't know what to look for, they don't know how to document, They don't have photographs. I don't know how you can certify it, especially when you're not out there on a regular basis, you know? Um, you need to be, engineers need to be trained in the process, what to look for, especially junior engineers when they're coming out to take your place. There needs to be a daily review of the paperwork, the CQA paperwork after the shift is complete. Should be turned in the next morning, but there needs to be that daily review by the engineer. Back throughout my career, I had engineers that, I turn in paperwork every morning. I got my punch list. I take care of things, call them if I have issues. 3 months later, I'm getting questions on the paperwork. That shouldn't happen. I mean, I don't remember the job 3 months later. I have no clue what happened 3 months later. I got to pull out my field book if I still have the same field book, try and figure it out. Those questions should have been asked the same day or the day after, no later than that. Answer calls from the field promptly. I've had issues there where people, well, I don't get into the office till 8:30. Well, it's 7 in the morning. We got a big issue. So we're standing around, the contractor's not doing anything because we have an issue. You got to have some flexibility, um, and be available when the jobs are available. Require complete, thorough daily field reports. That's another issue. And we're going to get into that, I don't think in this webinar, but upcoming, what should be in a daily field report.
On a side note, I will tell you that so often when we are doing a forensic analysis or failure analysis and audits, those DFRs are everything. And a lot of times we can look at the photos and tell you what went wrong before we even get into the data. They're really important.
Yeah, this slide here, kind of touching on what you're saying there, Joanna, but this is forensic analysis from an audit we were doing. And we start looking at the destruct results, and there were 33 extrusion, 92 fusion, wedge welded samples. And, there were issues. They had the wrong break code. And I don't know how, if it's a reputable laboratory, this happened. The data was just tabulated on a spreadsheet for the certification report, but the SE2 is only applicable to shear, and it was listed for 13 peel samples. SE3 is only applicable to peel. It was listed for one. We had different specimens that didn't have any elongation reported, which is a requirement based on ASTM D6392. And this was a fairly well-known laboratory in the United States, but there's discrepancies in how people do the testing. So that's something, as an engineer, if you see these things, if you read the actual ASTM, you should be calling the laboratory and making sure they're following the ASTM. These crosshead testing speeds were required. The averages were required, but none were reported. So things like that, we found where destructs have actually failed that were passed and nobody tracked them. That's a huge liability for the owner. If there's a failed seam out there and it's not been repaired, that's a huge liability. These things shouldn't be happening, and they can be avoided with a proper review process. What does CQA provide? What does it matter? We got reduces the liabilities. Ignorance is no excuse. That came out of a talk with a regulator. A regulator was saying about some of these problems, and they're, things we talk to them, try and get their take on, their position on training and, what they do if they see problems. And ignorance is no excuse. So this lack of training, it's going to come back to bite some owners at some point. CQA protects against failures. We have cost avoidance. The study of the cost of failures. And, we've seen huge cost associated with failures that could have been prevented, as we said, not only us, but the industry. This study's out there back from Ian Peggs in 2005 that studied this. And cost of avoidance is significantly lower than what the cost of failures are going to be, as Joanna mentioned earlier. And then your nasty PR issues, you're going to get a bad rap, and the whole industry might get a bad rap because something failed that shouldn't have failed. And a lot of times it's going to be on CQA. There's other issues too, design and all that, but really the focus of this is CQA and CQA throughout the design as well. Another strategy to avoid costly mistakes is being involved in the beginning. As I mentioned, CQA, inspect the material quality assurance, material quality control sheets. What are their results? Compare them with a conformance test. I've talked about this before, but your minimum average can be skewed by high values carrying low values. And we found with these low values in the material that welds failed, and overall your quality may fail. You may not want this in a high stress area. You may not want the material on site at all. So these things can be looked at. Same thing, I've mentioned this before, looking at your inventory. And we've just seen that on some projects again, where the roll numbers, there's gaps in the roll numbers. Usually they're going to be sequential rolls. And, kudos to the manufacturer. They caught something, they pulled some rolls out. So that's a good job. It indicates that they're trying, but things get missed. And there's, sometimes reasons they get missed. Sometimes the problem won't propagate itself right there where you're testing. It may not be at the end of a roll. It might be mid-roll where it starts up again. So it's not always the manufacturers didn't do their job, but it's something for CQA to keep an eye on. If there's missing rolls, make sure your CQA tech's looking at those rolls in the field. Is there an issue? Do you see blemished material? Those rolls should warrant more scrutiny when they're deployed in the field. And when they're deployed in the field, these things should be inspected as soon as they're deployed and safely secured. You don't want to be on there if there's a risk of it blowing away and getting somebody hurt. But as soon as it's safely secured to where they can weld it, you should be inspecting it so that before it gets welded up, like in the case here, you can see this textured material is missing. This is a highly textured material on the slope per the design, and the next panel deployed is missing a lot of texture and it's basically smooth. It doesn't meet the required friction angle, but this should have been caught before it was welded. Now that it's welded, people don't want to remove it. Now that it's welded, you got to create a bigger damage because you can't just replace that with one panel. Now you're going to need a cap strip in there to fill the gap. If it's proactive, if you get it dealt with right away, you can avoid this type of stuff. But a lot of this happens because people are understaffed. CQA, there's only one person. And installers know this. Admittedly, they'll tell you this if you talk to them. I mean, we've hired a lot of installers to do CQA throughout the years, and they all tell you the same thing. They'll play games. They'll do a trial weld. Pull the installer or the CQA person away from what they're supposed to be watching so they can do something else. And it's shouldn't be their mentality, but everybody's worried about being bottom dollar, unfortunately, and that don't always get you the best results. And then this is another one, paperwork. This is a mess of paperwork. And we generate a lot of paperwork, back in the day when everything was being done on paper, we're generating piles and piles of paperwork, but this is all paperwork that was turned in and it's incomplete. It's messy. It's shambles. And, the engineer should have realized that, but they didn't. It's really compromising the quality. If their paperwork's this bad, what were their inspection skills? It really adds to the issue.
And this is not an AI photo. We got it a couple weeks ago. One of our techs took over a job. They had a junior engineer filling in, and that's what she was handed. Here you go. Good luck.
Yeah.
It happens.
So now Joanna's going to talk to you about the accountability a little bit more.
So the more we enhance accountability within our own individual organizations, the more we strengthen the risk management for our site owners. And so what do I mean by all that corporate gobbledygook? So what I mean is, do you have an internal QC process where the design gets reviewed before it goes out? Do you have somebody in-house that's reviewing the drawings against the plans, against the specs? You're cross-checking all of those, where you're making sure that the latest and most modern practices and procedures are being put in. How within your organization can you ensure accountability for your portion of QA? Everybody on this call today has a QA role when it comes to the construction processes. It's not just us. I promise you, this webinar is not about a sales call. It's really about all of us seeing our role within QA and stepping up to the plate for our site owners. So then we're going to safeguard our organizations by setting vendor and employee expectations. So for me, I do field QA, my techs, don't let me catch you sitting in a truck all day long. You'll be off that site faster than your head can spin. I have an expectation that you're that guy with that club that's going to stand between problems and my site owner. And I'm going to give you those expectations. I'm going to tell you that that's my client's asset. They're putting their blood, sweat, and tears on the line for that asset to handle all of our garbage. You're going to put it on the line for them. This is my expectation. My expectation is that when a problem arises, you're going to step up to the plate and you're going to speak up. You're going to be professional, you're going to be kind, but you're not going to just let it go. Are you setting expectations for yourself, your employees, your vendors? If you're a site owner, you better look at that vendor and say, my expectation is you treat my asset correctly, that you're going to have my back, that you're going to be my eyes and ears, you're going to be my insurance policy, that you're going to stand in the gap. I am paying you to protect me. I expect that level of protection. We all need to have those conversations within our roles. If you're a regulator, you better be talking to your engineers. Engineers, it's your job to review these documents. Are you being proactive? Are you looking at the plans and saying, is this plan proactive? Is it proactively stopping a problem before it starts? And real basic way to do that in coupons, I call it a free quality check. It's no big deal to take a quick in coupon at the end of every seam, and then you can stop a problem before it proliferates throughout an entire project. There's a lot of things like that that we can do that are proactive, that we're simply not engaging as an industry, and it's time for us to step up and take care of our site owners. So your internal QC processes, start to formalize them now. Your training processes, start to formalize them. Step up to the plate and say, hey, look, I'm the guy with the yellow vest in the club, and I'm going to make sure that my team does its part. That's our challenge to everybody on this webinar today. Engineering firms, definitely. We want field construction training programs for every engineer. Every one of your engineers should have dirty boots. And when I say dirty boots, years ago, we were going to do a marketing campaign. And I said, look, I want pictures of dirty boots. Our dirty boots, the fact that we've been on those fields and we've had mud up to the middle of our thighs, that's our right to say what we say as a company. We've earned the right because we've spent the time in the field. We've been in the trenches. We've seen the great and we've seen the horrible. And that's how we have a right to say what we say. So I'm proud of those dirty boots. Every one of your engineers and junior engineers need to own some dirty boots. Make sure those boots are getting dirty, and make sure that you have a training program for all of them. Engineers, junior engineers, field technicians, make sure that they know what they're doing. Make sure when they get on a site, they understand how delicate the geomembrane is and they're not destroying it with their actions. You know, do your part to become proactive part of this industry. So do some surprise visits. So, you know, get out there. Hey, look, if you're a manager over a lot of engineers, surprise audit some of your engineering drawings. Say, hey, you know what? Send that over to me. I'm going to do a check on that. Show up on site. Hey, technicians, why are you in the truck? Get out now. That's not acceptable. You know, what are the proactive measures you can do for internal QC? And then make sure everybody understands their role in asset protection, and don't set that expectation once, set that expectation on a regular basis and do it formally. Want me to do site owners or you want to take it? Either way is good.
You can do it, I guess.
All right, site owners, we're in your corner on this. And a lot of site owners have a lot of site managers that are there. They're going to change job every couple of years. They want their bonuses. Come on, site owners. You need to get right in the trenches with those managers and say, no, 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 no. You're going to understand the situation. You're going to understand that this is my asset. You're not going to let them push through poor construction. We've literally had site managers say, look, I don't want an A job. Give me a C minus. Just get it done and get it quick. And as long as it's a C minus, we're okay. Really? You paid millions of dollars and you want a C minus? You're not on your company's management side, I'll tell you that. Site owners, audit your construction. People will only do what you inspect. Over and over again, they will do what you inspect. If you're not inspecting it, they can get away. They're going to do it. items we found in audits. I'm gonna tell you straight up, I'm still angry about some of these things. And I'm not generally a bitter person. I'm kind of a happy-go-lucky gal. But I've seen some site owners really take hits, and it's grieving, quite honestly. We just had a $1 billion site owner. We did a lot of work for them, and I'm still angry on their behalf because we saw a $1 billion engineering firm hose them over. And they now have massive liabilities. They have operational issues. The cost to them is significant. When you have engineers who don't look at DFRs for 6 months and sign off when 50% of the test failed to do what they were supposed to do, we got problems. And it's time to change. And you know what? We could say, well, that site owner should have blah, blah, blah. But you know what? That engineering firm should have done their job right. And at the end of the day, who do you think is going to pay for all these failures? It's going to be everybody in their trash bills and all of those things paying them. And you're like, well, I don't care if my trash bill's $10 higher. Well, you might not, but the single mom down the road trying to raise 3 kids on her own, she might. And the companies at some point, they need to be profitable. If they're not, they're going to get out of the business. And if you have good companies run away, you're going to get bad ones to take their place. We need to support them and stand up. So vet your engineers, vet your technicians, have a way to vet their knowledge base. So set the understanding your construction is your firm's financial asset over and over. This item's on our corporate balance sheet. The ROI is dependent upon you, site owners, managers, operators. It's your job to make sure that I get a return on my investment. And that doesn't mean cut every corner. Be a smart asset buyer. Put money where it pays off. Don't put it where it doesn't pay off. But at the end of the day, nobody needs $100, $600 million liability and judgment against them because they contaminated something. And site owners, you have to be proactive and protect yourself in all of this. Furthermore, have a system of making decisions based on the financial asset principles. So what are those? Bullet point 2 here is going to tell you, what's the required lifespan? I'm not so worried about crystallization in the weld. If it's a rain cap only going to be there for 6 months, we're probably all right. If this is a bottom liner system that's going to be entombed for God only knows how many hundreds of years, yeah, then we need to take a different approach to it. What's operational functionality? What is this supposed to do? Is it holding water for 2 months, some runoff, or is it a pregnant solution pond at a mining site and all their gold's going in there? Understand the operational functionality of the asset and treat it accordingly. Don't copy and paste the specs down. Don't let your engineers do that. Pay them to write the specs you need them to write if that's your pregnant solution pond, because you're not going to be happy when it's leaking. Understand the ease of exchange. A rain cap, maybe it doesn't take as much money because if you need to put a new one on, it's not a big deal. You want to replace a bottom liner for a heap leach pad? Ooh, whole different story. Bottom liner for a landfill, different story. So we need to be smart about our purchasing, smart about our designs, smart about our construction, and then always understand the return on investment. What do you need back? And what risk level are you comfortable with living with? And then hold your vendors to be accountable. You need to have weekly meetings. What are your failure ceilings? Hey, look, more than 5% of your welds are failing, we're stopping work. You're not going to keep going on my site with those kind of failures. We had a PVC site that saw up to 90% failure rates. It was ungodly. I mean, talk about 5%, forget 5%, we're at 90% failure rates. Oh my God. And the site owner needs to have some requirements. Set expectations. You're not going to have more than 5% failure. I'm going to get the project stats every week. How much material do we have left on site? Do we have enough to finish this job? Why are you blowing through material? How's it being wasted? What's going on? Have an accountability system that keeps you in control of your ROI in your project. Safeguarding an organization. All right. So, Glenn?
Yeah, things that really cost the owner. We had, and I mentioned it before in other webinars and training, but back in 2016, I actually tried to address this in the industry through a panel discussion with industry colleagues from all aspects, installers, manufacturers, and other people like that. But we were talking about these issues, cut and paste design, specifications, CQA plans. I've just mentioned it recently at a conference. I was talking to a colleague in Toronto. We think a lot of engineering, the designs are cut and paste anymore. People aren't really doing what they need to do. And one reason why was a quote from somebody in the back of the room. They spoke up. They said the owner won't pay us to update or develop new specifications. But that's somebody's got to step up and do that. You got to say, you got to put your foot down and say, hey, you're not going to get the quality job you want if you don't do this. Um, and another thing we commonly see is lack of incorporation of the latest technologies and or materials in the design because it's cut and paste, and people don't want to look at new ways. Maybe they don't have the knowledge to look at new ways. But you're not doing anyone any favors. In project management, really is by everyone. It's got to be done throughout the complete life cycle. And we constantly see most of these liabilities and issues that come up could have been mitigated if they were just addressed either during the design somewhere, you know, construction, wherever it may be, they could have been addressed before the construction was completed, um, and the project was certified. So moving on to the pyramid of success, what we see as the pyramid of success, I've talked to people, I've had this graphic for like 10 years or 15 years out there, but it really starts with the owner being involved and having accountability, getting into your vendor selection, holding them accountable, your design, your specifications, making sure you have competent people doing these tasks, proper materials and equipment and procedures, and then your field work. That's where everybody sees tangible progress. It's a bigger cost dollar item of the project. You can see things getting done, but the success of that field work and your overall project really depends on your operations from the beginning. The owner being involved and having their vision translated throughout the whole process. And we superimpose this image here on a clay because it's really the foundation, and your foundation needs to be solid through the owner and everybody else. Everything might be stacked against your success, especially if you're not picking the right vendors to do the work for you, and they're not properly educated. They don't know what to do. So that's really the bulk of this presentation. The next webinar is going to be coming up July 19th or July 17th and 12:30 Eastern. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really going to focus more on certification reports, signed, sealed, and debunked. We're seeing certification reports out there. We're doing forensic audits on stuff, and it's mind-boggling the things we're seeing. So we'll talk about that next time. And we're going to get into questions and answers here. I'm going to see if any of you have any questions. I thank Joanna for joining me. I thank you for joining me as well out there, and I look forward to seeing you next month. So let's get into see if we have any
And
questions.
I promise his more troublesome counterpart will not be interrupting his webinar next month.
No, I was going to have you do it, but
I don't think so.
So let's see, where's my thing here? Can I go there? Make big maybe. There.
Right.
So let's see if there's any questions. There's no questions that we see here on the thing. I forgot to tell you to use the question and answer feature. So if anybody's still out there has a question, we got another minute or two left, and yeah, shoot me a question.
Please
Appreciate
pester
you.
him. I do all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we appreciate you all tuning in. Thank you for taking time out of Juneteenth. If you're celebrating that, I know federal holiday. I don't know about state employees and all the different states, but appreciate you tuning in, and definitely look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.